What's up, everybody? Wait, 1 second. Much better. What's up, everybody? How's it going? In this video, I'm going to be wearing one of my Google t-shirts because in this video, I'm going to be pulling from my experience as a former software engineer at Google. Some might even call me an ex-Google software engineer, and I'm going to be pulling from that experience and sharing with you what it was like being an interviewer at Google, someone who interviewed other software engineers applying to Google, specifically interviewing them with coding interviews. Now, I think that this video is going to be really insightful because, first of all, I don't think that there's really any material about this online, and if there is some, it's super obscure. You never really know if it's trustworthy. And two, I think that this is going to be really helpful for you, especially if you're applying to a company like Google or any other big tech company, because all the stuff that I'm going to be saying here very much applies to other companies like Facebook, Amazon, etc. But the reason it's going to be useful is because you're going to kind of see what happens behind the scenes, right? How interviewers are trained, who actually ends up interviewing you, how are questions picked, how are you graded. Hopefully it'll kind of humanize the process and give you a bit of confidence both in yourself and in the process. But so with that, let's jump right into it, and let's start by talking about who actually ends up interviewing you, the candidate. Is it some special person whose role is only to interview software engineers? Is it somebody else? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. The person who's going to be interviewing you when you're applying to a company like Google or Facebook as a software engineer is, or are, because you're going to have multiple interviewers, are existing software engineers at those companies at Google, except that they must have been trained, they have to have been trained beforehand to interview candidates. They have to have gone through some form of training. Now, the way that it works at Google or Facebook is after a certain period of time that you've been working at the company, so you can't be someone, an engineer who's worked at the company for one day and then interview someone. No, you have to have worked for, if I remember correctly, 6 months at Google. I hope that I'm remembering correctly. It might be 12 months, but I'm pretty sure it's 6 months. Maybe someone who's at Google can confirm this for me. But so after 6 months of having been a software engineer, full-time software engineer at Google, you suddenly become eligible. Is it eligible or eligible? You become eligible. I think it's eligible. You become eligible to take a class, the interview training class. And when I say eligible or eligible, I really mean like required. You actually have to take this class. It's not like 100% requirement, like you're not going to get fired if you don't take it. Some people who really don't want to interview will kind of weasel out of it, but it is expected for you to take it because hiring at Google, especially hiring software engineers, is super important. Like software engineers are the lifeblood of Google, and if you don't keep hiring super talented software engineers, you don't have a company like Google. And because they need to hire so many people, because so many people apply, so they need to conduct so many interviews, they need a lot of interviewers, and so they need every software engineer to get trained to become an interviewer. And so you sign up for this class and you take the class. Usually there are like 30 or 40 people taking a single class like that. And if I remember correctly, the class is anywhere between 4 hours and 8 hours. It might be the full day, I forget. Just during your work hours. And during the class, they basically teach you, everything from how you're going to pick questions, what you're supposed to do in interviews, what you're supposed to look for, how you're going to grade people, how you're going to evaluate them, how decisions are made. They tell you about the whole reasoning behind the process. It's actually a pretty good class. Though I will say here, it's not rocket science either. It's actually to some extent formulaic. What I say to some extent because as the interviewer, what you do in the interview and the way that you kind of assess people is almost formulaic, but then the process as a whole isn't quite as formulaic because you have 5 different interviewers interviewing the same candidate with different problems and with different experience levels and all that. You don't end up with this completely formulaic process. And it's not like, you get a specific score, and if you score a little bit higher, then you pass, and if you score a little bit under something, you fail. It's not like that. But the process for the interviewer, again, is kind of formulaic. So the point that I'm trying to make is that it is actually very possible for someone who has otherwise not been an interviewer before to get trained to conduct these interviews properly. However, I will make one more caveat, which is that ultimately I do believe that within a group of interviewers or amongst a group of interviewers, there will always be some people who are naturally or by way of practice better at conducting interviews and others who are worse. And that's just kind of part of life and part of this process. But as you'll see a bit later when we talk about grading and how hiring decisions are made, the fact that some interviewers might not be great interviewers doesn't necessarily matter that much for the final outcome. But so, okay, you've taken this training class, and the next step in the process is for you, the interviewer, to go through what's called a shadow interview. What a shadow interview is a real interview. So, imagine, you're a candidate and you are having an interview at Google and you're assigned an interviewer, someone who's been trained, who's done interviews in the past, blah, blah. But then you or me, the interviewer who has just been trained, I'm going to be assigned to shadow one of your interviews. So I'm going to be in the room with another interviewer, a qualified one, and I'm not really going to speak. I'm just going to be there in the background. But you, the candidate, you're going to see me. Or if you're doing a Zoom interview or a Google Hangouts interview, you're going to see me on the call. But I'm not going to be interacting with you. All I'm going to be doing is grading you, assessing you, as I would if I were your main interviewer, except I'm not your main interviewer. And the goal here is to see whether or not, as a shadow interviewer, your assessment, your grade, kind of matches the one that the real interviewer gives. And that's a good way to see whether or not you are, doing well as an interviewer. Because if the person who's doing the real interview gives the candidate, let's say, a strong hire, says like, this candidate was amazing, great algorithmic skills, blah, blah. But you, as the shadow interviewer, you say strong no hire, then clearly there's something wrong. It's not necessarily that you were bad, but clearly there's something wrong, right? And so sometimes you have to go through multiple shadow interviews. I only had to go through one. I think most people only have to go through one, but that's something that you have to do. And by the way, as the candidate, you might actually fall on an interview where there's someone shadowing your interviewer. I remember when I interviewed at Facebook, my first interview of the morning, I had two people because one of them was shadowing the other. But so once the shadow interview is done, and once you pass the shadow interview, you then become an official Google interviewer. And so there's an internal tool where you can sign up and put your schedule and, basically you can say how many times you'd like to interview candidates, like once a week, twice a week, once a month, 5 times a week, right? It really depends on your personal preferences. You can also specify when in the day, like do you not want to do interviews in the mornings? Do you not want to do interviews in the afternoons? I never wanted to do interviews in the mornings. I also wasn't a fan of lunch interviews. I preferred doing the actual interviews. And so once you've done that, you will then be, you will get recurring emails telling you, hey, you've been scheduled to interview a candidate on such and such a date at such and such time. And also you can specify whether you are down to interview interns too, because normally, we're talking about full-time employees here, but you can also say, hey, I'm down to interview interns. I actually interviewed interns. I interviewed at least 5 interns when I was at Google, but otherwise mostly full-time software engineers. And that's that. Now, the next thing that you might be wondering is how are questions selected? Like when you are in a Google coding interview and you get a specific coding interview question, how is that question selected? Did some sort of committee select it? Did your interviewer select it? Well, the truth is your interviewer selected it. Now, there are some guidelines that are given to you as an interviewer for how to select questions, and there's an internal question bank at Google that gets updated very frequently. Some questions are banned, and they're banned when they're either found online or when they've become too popular or when, people seem to be really doing bad on them and people start to agree, interviewers start to agree that it's just a bad question. There are all kinds of reasons for which a question might get banned. So you can pick from this question bank, but you also have a lot of flexibility to pick kind of your own questions that might not necessarily be in the question bank. And this is where it's actually very interesting. And I was even surprised myself at how much flexibility and, by extension, responsibility is put on the interviewer, because you can kind of do anything you want as an interviewer. It's a little bit weird. Again, you have these guidelines. It's not like I'm going to walk in the interview and just like quiz you on, I don't know, like, Linux if you're a normal software engineer. No, it has to be like a normal algorithm style coding interview question, exactly the kinds of questions that you'll find on online platforms like AlgoExpert, my company. By the way, if you're preparing for your Google interviews or any coding interviews, then definitely check out my company, AlgoExpert, or if you're preparing for systems design interviews. But seriously, my company, AlgoExpert, we have helped so many people land jobs, especially at Google. Like, Google, I think, is one of our most represented companies. It's either Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. Those are the three companies that we always hear candidates from tell us that they've aced their interviews there. But so definitely check it out. Go to algoexpert.io and use the promo code CLEM, CLEM, for a discount on the platform. So the point is, interviewers can kind of pick whatever question they want to ask, so long as it is an algorithm-style interview question, and so long as it's not like explicitly banned. But again, this is where, like I said earlier, even though there's this weird sense of like flexibility here and responsibility on the interviewer, and in theory the interviewer can kind of mess up, you'll see as we get into the grading portion, which is what I'm about to enter, that it all kind of like works out in the end. The last thing that I want to say about just question curation and all that, the way that we ensure that you, the candidate, don't get asked two of the same question twice is, first of all, like, law of probability, or what am I saying? Law of probability. Probability dictates that you will likely just not fall on the same question in an interview. Like, there's so many different questions that could be asked. You're unlikely to get the same one from two back-to-back interviewers. But otherwise, interviewers, at least back when interviews were conducted in person, would write down on a sheet of paper, like, briefly describe the question. Like, they would put like the title of the question or description. And usually, as the interviewer, you walk in, you take a quick glance, and you can kind of know whether or not your question has been asked. I will say that is an important thing. Like, as an interviewer, you have to prepare more than one question, just so that you're not, kind of like when you walk in an interview and you're like, oh, fuck, like this person asked the same question I was going to ask, so now I don't know what to do. You don't want that to happen. So that's how we ensure that you, the candidate, don't get asked the same question twice. Now, let's talk about grading. Grading is something that I think everybody wants to know. Like, how are you actually assessed in a coding interview? And here, I'm not going to go too far into detail, but the TLDR is that there is a rubric that, or a form, effectively, that the interviewer has to fill out after the interview. And the form has multiple sections. And here, I would highly encourage you to go check out the feedback form that we have on our mock interview feature on AlgoExpert. There's a template for the feedback form that you can access even without having done a mock interview, so you can access it even if you don't own AlgoExpert. And that feedback form is almost identical to the one that actual interviewers at Google have and have to fill out. And you'll see that there are basically categories like, your algorithm skills, your coding ability, your communication skills, your problem-solving ability. Those are the big four, and they have like 4 different scores that you can assign, and with description text. And again, like, that feedback form is very similar to the one internal at Google. And then there are even other categories that are kind of like less important, but things like, does the candidate like thrive in under ambiguity? Things about leadership, which aren't necessarily accessible. Is that a word? Accessible, I think so, in an interview, and in that case, the interviewer leaves those blank. But the 4 really big important ones are the ones that we have in that mock interview feedback form. And then there is the final sort of decision, which is the higher decision, and you have 6 scores here: strong, no higher, leaning, no higher, leaning higher, higher, strong, higher. Now, I want to say something here, which is that there is no formula or rules set in stone that says that if a candidate gets, 3 strong hires, at least they get hired, or 4 hires, at least they get hired. No, it can depend, no matter what your end result is, you could either get hired or not hired. It all really does depend on the circumstance and just the interview feedback, because then there's a little bit more feedback. There's a little bit of written feedback. You can add like notes. First of all, you have to specify also the question that you asked of the candidate, but you can add notes. Like, if I put like, strong no hire, despite having put like very good scores in coding ability, problem solving, communication, like I should explain why I put strong no hire. Maybe it's because you did something absolutely like unacceptable or something, super obnoxious. You told me to go fuck myself in the middle of the interview. Then I would put like strong no hire. But maybe I would put like hire for like comedy. No, I wouldn't. But strong no hire. But anyway, what was I saying? Yeah. So like there are notes, and also before I forget, I'll get to like what happens after the grade is given or the form is submitted. But right after the interview, like 30 minutes after the interview, you as the interviewer are prompted to fill out a quick feedback form, which basically is like, just tell me, or tell the recruiter what your final decision is, hire, strong hire, and maybe a few little bullet points just to get like quick feedback while the interview is fresh in your mind. And then you fill out the main form in the day or two afterwards. And here, how fast you fill out the form is entirely up to you, the interviewer. And so if you're a software engineer applying to Google and you don't hear back from your recruiter with interview feedback for like a week, it's almost certainly because of an asshole interviewer, maybe not an asshole, but like an interviewer who just hasn't filled out their feedback yet. Whereas if you get your feedback really quickly, it's because all your interviewers were nice and filled it out in 1 or 2 days. And it's really important to be prompt with that, but life happens and sometimes they take longer. And so once the feedback is completed as the interviewer, you're done. Like once I've completed my feedback and I've pressed submit or whatever, I am done. The only thing is I will have access to your result, like you, the candidate. I will have access to your result, or at least the decision of your result once it comes out. And I will have access to a little bit more data, but I'll get into that in a second. The result itself is going to be decided by a hiring committee. So there's a hiring committee, a group of like better trained engineers. These are people who have been trained specifically for the hiring committee, who will literally sit in a room and go through a ton of interview packets, and they will look at all the feedback from all the interviewers, all the scores, and they will make the final decision. And so this is what I was getting at earlier when I said that, even though there might be some problems in the process, like maybe an interviewer is bad or an interviewer decides to pick a question that they really shouldn't have, it doesn't really matter because the hiring committee is extremely well trained to spot anomalies. So if they see in an interview slate that there are 4 interviewers who gave like a strong hire to someone, but then the 5th one gave a strong no hire, they're going to dig into that to try to see like what happened. Like, is it that that person genuinely deserved a strong no hire? Maybe it's really important. It's a big red flag. That person did something unacceptable. Like they insulted the interviewer, and that should hold a lot of weight. Or maybe it has nothing to do with that. The person gave a strong no hire because of like bad coding ability. But it turns out that the person who gave the strong no hire is a brand new interviewer who's never conducted any interviews before at Google. This is their first official one. Whereas the 4 other interviewers are people who've conducted like 100 different interviews and whose final grades or final hiring decisions have historically matched the actual decision that the candidate gets. And so in those cases, that strong no hire is going to get almost like no value or no weight, and the candidate will likely still end up getting hired. And so the point is that during this hiring committee process here, any sort of anomaly or problem or lack of signal will be captured. If it happens that like 2 people gave a hire decision, 2 people gave a no hire decision, but like, there are weird anomalies, like the 2 people who gave a no hire gave really positive feedback for communication and problem solving, but terrible feedback for coding ability. But then the 2 people who gave a hire decision gave great coding ability, but terrible coding skill, or great coding ability, but terrible communication skills and problem solving ability, right? Like if there's like conflicting stuff, then the hiring committee might say, you know what, like this doesn't make sense. We need to do more interviews for this candidate. And that's why sometimes as a candidate, you'll actually be contacted by your recruiter and they'll tell you, you have to do like 2 more interviews, right? Or if like the hiring committee realizes that a question was asked, but wasn't like, it's not a good question, they dig into it and they're like, this question really like is too difficult or something like that, right? They might also devalue what one of the interviewers said. Again, here it's absolutely not formulaic. This is what I meant earlier. This part of the process is very like non-formulaic. There's a lot of judgment that's used and assessment and relying on past data. And this is where like Google is super well trained for this. Like they've done this so much. They've conducted so many interviews. They can see the historical data of interviewers and they can see whether a particular interviewer tends to give hiring decisions that eventually match the full decision or not. And again, if they see that like there's an interviewer that historically grades harsher than other interviewers, then they will take that into consideration. So this is why I always remind candidates not to think too much or try to overly assess your performance in an interview, because there are just so many different factors. Like if you got a really difficult question, or if your interviewer seemed really mean, or you feel like you bombed it, like don't. You have no idea what is actually going on behind the scenes. There's so many different variables. And similarly, if you're someone who passed the Google interviews and you're like, oh no, I have imposter syndrome, I somehow faked my way, like the hiring committee made a mistake. No, no, they didn't. Okay, like they almost certainly didn't. They're trained for this. They've done this, like thousands of times. Let's put a little bit of, confidence, or have a little bit of confidence in the trillion-dollar company that is Google, and realize that they know what they're doing and they've really like refined their interview process. So the final thing as the interviewer is, once the candidate gets their decision, you get to see for a couple days what that decision was, and you get to see other interviewer feedback. And so it's always interesting as the interviewer to see, did your feedback actually match others? So like I've had times where, I'll give like a strong no hire, and I'm not happy to give a strong no hire. And I'm like, I really wonder, like, did this candidate like just completely bomb? Like, were they bad, or did they just have a bad time with me? And then I see, okay, wait, like they actually did pretty good in all the other interviews. Or I see like, oh wait, yeah, like every single other interviewer gave a strong no hire. Like clearly this person didn't use Algo Expert. But yeah, that's a good thing. And then also as an interviewer, you have access to a page that shows you just like historical data about you. So it gives you that thing of like, how many times has your final decision matched what was actually given to the candidate? And that's a good data point as an interviewer to see whether or not, you're effectively, like that's kind of the best way to see if you're a good Google interviewer. If your hiring decision almost always matches the entire decision that gets made. The last thing that I want to leave you with here is to say that as an interviewer, trust me when I say this, when you walk into the room or into the video call with the candidate that you're interviewing, you never want them to fail. Like, don't think that the interviewer is against you. They are at best with you and rooting for you, or at worst, kind of just like indifferent, but they never come in thinking like, I want this fucking candidate to get like rejected. Like, no, unless they have something like wrong in their head, like they're not gonna think that, right? As an interviewer, you're completely impartial. And if anything, you're just like, I was in that seat once, I want them to do well, right? So just remember that the next time that you walk into an interview, like everything is being done to make you succeed. So hopefully that should give you a bit of like confidence and reassurance. So anyway, that's all that I've got for you about what it's like being an interview at Google, or an interviewer at Google. Hopefully you found it insightful. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. As always, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter if you enjoy short form written content, Instagram if you like pictures, and otherwise I will see you in the next one.